Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Stimson Center. My name is Brian Finlay. I'm the president and CEO here at Stimson. We are very pleased to continue our ongoing President's Chairman's Forum here at Stimson. That is just the door. It is not, the room is not coming apart. And we're very pleased today, of course, to be welcoming Australia's ambassador to the United States, Joe Hockey. Ambassador Hockey arrived in Washington in January of 2016 after a distinguished career in public service. He joined the Australian Parliament, was elected to Parliament in 1996, where he served on the bench before a series of cabinet positions, including, most notably, head of the, as Treasurer, we might say Minister of Finance and Secretary of the Treasury. In his time in Canberra, he is a banking and finance lawyer by trade. But most importantly, he is, as you may be aware, perhaps the most user-friendly ambassador here in Washington, D.C. And so that is why this will be, I suspect, a very enjoyable and entertaining as well conversation. You know, you may think that the post of Australian ambassador to Washington is a sleepy sinecure, and I suspect that the ambassador, when he arrived here in Washington, was a little bit hoping for that, but he has not had that ride since January of 2016, and has been in the crosshairs of probably much more attention than he anticipated, and maybe even more attention than he would have preferred. What we'd like to do here this morning is really just give him an opportunity to give a few framing remarks to all of you, to all of us. Then he will join me for just a brief conversation, and we will quickly open it up to all of you as well. And so, without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I give you the Honourable Joe Hockey.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brian. Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador, thank you for coming along today. And I was asked to make a few introductory remarks about the relationship between our countries, but also to talk about some of the challenges, which I think we'll discuss more in the Q&A. The relationship between Australia and the United States goes back a very long way. As the current president said, we were both born out of pretty similar circumstances. It's just that you guys came about 150 years before us. And the fact is we were both rebellious children of the British Empire, or whatever it was that was formed at that time. But from the same experiences, we have created diverse English-speaking multinational nations that have led to peoples that have tended to demand to be in control of their own destiny and to forge their own destiny rather than to have an excessive over-reliance on the gift of government. And, of course, one of the early starts to our relationship was the gold rush in Australia. It was closely linked to the gold rush in California. And, in fact, one of your presidents ran one of the most successful and still ongoing mines, Sons of Gwalia. Herbert Hoover was quite a cantankerous character, but obviously was a very determined character. And it was only after he had the deep experiences of mining in Western Australia that he was able to develop the skills that would accommodate the demands of being President of the United States in those days. The fact is that from a military perspective, we've been deeply engaged with the United States for 99 years. From the Battle of Hamel, which took place on the 4th of July in 1918, when 4 companies of American soldiers fought for the first time under a foreign general. And he was an Australian Jewish general, John Monash. And we're the only country on earth that has fought side by side with the United States in every single major conflict since that day. No other country has been there for all of those battles. But it's not just about being there at the military end, at the economic end. Of course, the United States is the largest investor in Australia. Without your capital and much of your innovation, so much of the landscape in Australia would not have been developed. One trade agreement I'm sure will not be torn up is the agreement between Australia and the United States, because you have a $25 billion surplus in your favour. So it is, and that's fine by us, because the trade deficit we have with the United States helps us to have a significant trade surplus with China, because we have used much of the equipment that you manufacture and much of the investment you make to develop our vast resources. Australia has a population the size of Florida in a land that is virtually as large as the continental United States. So without huge amount of imported capital, we couldn't develop much of our industry. And so many businesses over the years, from Ford and General Motors, right through to a range of other businesses, have helped to develop what is now known as multinational and multilingual nation of Australia, with a huge number of companies with diverse interests. And each year, around 750,000 Americans visit Australia. It is still the most preferred travel destination for Americans in the world, if time and money were not to be considered, of course. But it is the most desired travel destination in the world for the American people. And more than 1 million Australians travel to the United States every year. So that helps to develop the cross-cultural links in the arts, in the film industry. Many famous Australian actors, producers, directors, and technicians have engaged in the film industry, or on Broadway, or off Broadway, or in the arts more generally, the visual arts and dance and theatre. But it's also the case that our relationship spreads through the education sector. Literally hundreds of thousands of Australian students and American students study in each other's countries each year. Through to medical research, where there's a tremendous cross-collaboration in a range of different areas, from cancer research right through to diabetes research and so on. There is a huge amount of collaboration. In space exploration, we are very active partners. In fact, it was the dish just outside of Canberra that received the first signals from Neil Armstrong's landing on the moon all those years ago, and was able to beam it across to the United States into the homes of so many Americans and so many people around the world. And at a military level, as I said, it is still ongoing. Today we have military personnel in 31 US states. 31 US states. And we are a massive purchaser of American military equivalent. We have a military budget that is exceeding 2% of GDP. That's an interesting benchmark. Pluck that out of the air, of course. And but we also, we're the second biggest external purchaser of the Joint Strike Fighter, and we have a deep engagement with the Marines, running a rotation out of Northern Australia as a result of President Obama's visit a few years ago, and the deeper engagement in our region. And at an intelligence level, we are obviously one of the Five Eyes partners of the United States. And it's been reported in the past that Australia has been identified as the country that has the most interactions with the US intelligence agencies of any country in the world, even including our great friends in Britain. So that's very real, and it's continuing. And so given that we've got an economic relationship, a trade relationship, a people-to-people relationship, a cultural relationship, it's not an accident of history that we are very much aligned with the values that are represented by everyday Americans. Some things we will disagree on. Gun laws is something we disagree on. There are some attitudes that Americans have that we don't share. Similarly, there are some attitudes we have that certainly Americans don't share. But the things that carry relationships beyond individual generations come down to shared values. And it's one thing to be an ally, it's another thing to be a mate. And from our perspective, a mateship or being a buddy is based on shared values. And that's displayed time and time again. It means that you have a level of tolerance for each other, a level of honesty with each other that endures no matter what happens or where it happens. And that's been a great strength of our relationship, and that's one of the reasons why I was so happy to be asked by the Prime Minister to come to Washington, because in many ways it's about reaffirming the relationship, not taking it for granted, but reaffirming it, and also helping where help is needed, providing advice where it's requested, giving advice sometimes where it's not wanted. That's the strength of the relationship and will continue to be so. So, Brian, thank you for having me at the Stimson Centre. There's a number of people here that I'm sure have very interesting questions as well as your own. I'm happy to be able to support your work. And thank you to Stimson for so much of the collaboration that is done with the Australian government over quite a considerable period of time, from work of mutual interest and benefit at the United Nations right through to a number of collaborations on policy affecting individual countries around the world. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you. So, Ambassador, thank you for that again, and for joining us. As I mentioned at the outset, you've had a bit of a tumultuous ride here in Washington since you.
It's easier than the last ride I
had. Maybe that's right. All right, I'll let you. But what a terrible job you have! It's a terrible job you have. Not at all. It is hyperbole, I think, to sit here in Washington, and many ambassadors, I will say, have sat in that chair and claimed a special relationship, of course, with the United States. But truly, Canberra does lay maybe special claim to that special status. As you pointed out, it is a relationship that really truly has been forged in blood as Australian servicemen and women have served in literally every combat operation since the early 1900s alongside the United States. And it's a claim that even as a Canadian, I will come out and tell you, even our northern neighbors cannot lay claim to that. But that said, it's also true that I think the practice of international relations has become much more complex, not because of any administration here in Washington, but it is a global phenomenon, I think it is fair to say. But it's particularly consequential, I think, when there is uncertainty emerging from Washington. And I think in any change of administration, there is, of course, uncertainty. But I think, in particular, for many, many reasons, we are at really a pace of change and uncertainty that has not been, I think, witnessed in American politics for many years. So let me ask you this: is Canberra losing faith in America's ability to lead?
No.
Tell me.
Well, it comes back to the issue of values. And to understand the United States, far be it for me to sit here and say to an American audience that this is what the US is. But I just remind people back home, the US lost more of its own people fighting against its own people in the US Civil War than every other war combined. Every single other war combined. More people. And it is, it is truly the United States. It is an incredibly diverse nation with a lot of different interests. You say, it's a tumultuous time with the administration, a new administration. Let me tell you, it's a tumultuous time around the world. Really, there's no playbook for modern politics. The only rule that seems to apply in modern politics is incumbents are hammered, and opposition teams, as disruptive as they can be or choose to be, have a massive electoral advantage heading into a poll. Now, incumbency is really, really hard in modern politics. It's incredibly hard. And part of it comes back, if you choose to do it, to read, for example, Thomas Friedman's book, Thank You for Being Late, where he identifies 2007 as a tipping point in history. And in so much he's right. For the first time in history, things have got beyond the capacity of the legislators or the courts or others to respond. The world's changing so rapidly that political leaders can't keep up. And naturally enough, legislation is usually responsive. It responds to the will of the people. But the world's changing so rapidly that no amount of legislation can keep up with what's happening in the world and changing expectations. So what government's got to try and do is think more about facilitating the change rather than trying to wind it back or impeding it. Or you've just got to facilitate that change and hope that community standards lift to manage the expectations of the community. That's really hard. It's incredibly hard. It's much harder in this world to be an advocate than it is to be a critic. And that's quite the change. That's quite the change. So, my view about the administration is, we find it incredibly accessible. We find everyone there very prepared to listen, very consultative, but also they do want to work in partnership. And from our perspective, from an Australian perspective, we've found the Trump administration very, very easy to deal with, contrary to some of the perception.
So let me ask you this, to be a little bit more specific, in the Asia-Pacific region. Yeah. Let's think about policy. In the last administration, we heard a lot of rhetoric, and we can debate as to whether there was any there about the Asia pivot, and much of the at least political attention was certainly focused in your backyard. We might say now we don't hear that rhetoric, certainly now, from the new administration. And I think it is safe to say, at least for those of us on the outside of the official process, who are not regular invitees into the Oval Office, that there is a sense that there is certainly more confusion in terms of policy. There have been mixed signals, I think, from the administration that I think is quite clear. I think it's also a common understanding that this has opened up opportunities, certainly in that for other governments beyond the United States too. But it's also opened up for opportunities for countries that may not share American or Australian values as well to exploit opportunities in the region. Does that worry you?
It's not the case that all allies share values, right? I mean, that's been... Allies there's a whole lot of interests that go into forming an alliance. Some of it is a common enemy. Some of it is, a geopolitical pivot. Some of it can be economic resources related. There aren't many alliances you have where you actually have the same values. And I just want to emphasise those alliances where you do share the same values are more robust, more reliable, more enduring, and far more tolerant than those alliances where it's a matter of convenience. So that's the starting point. America cannot exit Asia. I think there are about 150,000 dead American soldiers buried in the sand between Australia and Japan. So that's an intergenerational burden felt by so many countries, right? And it's a debt. So, the US is not abandoning. In fact, it's increasing its military presence in the Pacific. But, the US, it can't be inconsistent in the Pacific. In one sense, I think it was Secretary Mattis that said the period of strategic patience with North Korea has ended. That, from our perspective, is a welcome statement. I mean, for too long, everyone was trying to wait them out, and it didn't work. Failed quite miserably, and now we're on the threshold of them having the capacity not only to hit the United States but to hit Australia as well. It should never have got to that point. And the South China Sea should never have got to the point where it's at the moment either, where there was lots of rhetoric and proper processes, but China has expanded its reach in that region. There's no argument about that. So, in order, the US, we want the US engaged in the Asia region. They are engaged in the Asia-Pacific region because they have to be. It's the fastest growing region, not only in the world, but arguably in the history of humanity. And there are 500 million people in the middle class in the Asia-Pacific region today. In 14 years, it'll be 2 billion, right? So the demand for what America produces, the demand for what Australia produces, is going to rise dramatically. And they want what we have. They want freedom. They want opportunity to engage in enterprise. They want better quality health care. They want better quality education. They want better quality air. They want bigger homes, nicer cars, to be able to invest for their own security when they retire. And that's the fundamental point. That's the strength of the US and Australia and a number of other countries in not only Asia-Pacific but around the world. I mean, America has had the only empire in the history of humanity that people have wanted to join. A lot of, imperial powers, if you can use that term very broadly, have invaded other countries to spread their values. And you go through the history from Rome right or Greece right through, right? America is the only country that has had the gravitational pull because of its values. That people actually want to sign up. Vietnam, for example, wants to become a part through, and it was through TPP, right? And Vietnam was saying, we're there. And you're at war. We were at war with Vietnam not that long ago. And yet they want to come and join. Why? Because they want to share those values. They're not at the same point. They haven't got wholly open economy and wholly, freedom of speech and democracy necessarily, but they want to they're heading in that direction. So it's a values-based leadership. And America is reluctant at times. It's shown by its reluctance to get into World War I and its reluctance to get into World War II. And it is a reluctant global leader. And you can understand that because there's been enormous sacrifices by the American people to have that global leadership role. But it can't walk, if America walks away from its values, then that's when it walks away from its global leadership. But because America is not walking away from its values, in my view, it is not walking away from its values. Therefore, it is, whether it likes it or not, is going to remain the global leader.
So America is walking away from TPP, and it is walking away from Paris. And what does that tell you? Does that suggest to you that that it is more than a reluctance? That is, the international community may want to be on our island. The America chooses to be on an island unto itself. What does that mean? How do you explain that to Canada?
Well, I don't see it as a move towards isolationism because the US, at a citizen-to-citizen level, as a business-to-business level, at a NGO-to-NGO level, is too integrated in the world, much more so than when it's gone through previous periods of isolationism. It's more, a reflection of the diversity of views in the United States. We were incredibly disappointed with the US not signing up to TPP. And we were very strong advocates with a number of our friends for the TPP because it set benchmarks for the Asia-Pacific region, the fastest growing region in the world, that others weren't setting. So, and that was to the great advantage of those that adhere to a rules-based order and benchmarks and standards. So we don't agree with that. We don't agree with the United States pulling out of Paris. We're not pulling out of Paris. We strongly support, the Paris Agreement, and we disagree in that space. But there are other areas where we do agree, and the fact that the US is asking NATO to step up to increase its financial commitment to military spending, we strongly support. The fact that, the United States is looking to be more active in a range of different areas in our region, at a bilateral level. The relationship with Japan is very close, and the new administration extremely close. The fact that the United States is saying pretty bluntly to China, you've got to take a lead in fixing North Korea. I mean, that we agree with that. We agree with that. That's how you're going to get solutions. The very active on-the-ground partnering with the United States, Australia, and other countries to try and prevent the spread of, an influence of Daesh in our region, is particularly through returning fighters, that's a very deep, very collaborative relationship. And of course, American companies, businesses, are massively engaged throughout our region, from obviously Facebook and Apple right through to, a whole lot of advisory firms, manufacturers, and others.
Has the new administration on pick your issue? Has it have changed policies here in Washington impacted your bilateral alliance relationships in the region with Japan, with China, with the Philippines? Has there been a net impact? Are there perturbations in the system that we in Washington do not see because we sit in the bubble of the district?
I think they're strengthened. Look, obviously when the leadership in Washington asks the question, then that question reverberates around the world. I mean, America has a megaphone on a scale that no one else has. And so, there was more interest in Australia in the US election than there was in Australia in the Australian election. That says quite a bit. But it is a reflection of the fact that, American news is interesting and quite pervasive. There are some countries that ask the question, does the US still want to lead? Because the US is asking itself that question. Pretty reasonable. From our perspective, we've only seen a strengthening in the relationship with, key allies like Japan and India, and Indonesia and Singapore and Malaysia and, a range of other countries. South Korea, I see that new president of South Korea has sent an special envoy to Australia today, and I think the second country was India today, just overnight, determined to strengthen ties. And what's happened is the US has said, hang on, we're questioning how active we want to be leading the world. Other countries have had to step up. So you now see a real opportunity for Europe to take more of a leadership role. You're starting to see countries in Asia say, well, okay, we just can't rely on America for everything. We've got to take more of a leadership role. And I see that as a good thing because it helps to balance the world out a bit more.
Could it be a bad thing?
Well, it's a bad thing if it ends up in kinetic activity between various protagonists. But I just don't see any movement to that space. I mean, the President of the United States and the President of China are working collaboratively to try and contain and heavily influence North Korea's direction. This is a damn good thing, right? I mean, it's really important. And the Europeans are taking more of a role in dealing with Russia than simply leaving it all to the United States. The Saudis and others are taking more of a leadership role in the Middle East, more prominent role, including standing up to some of their own who have been actively, arguably, supporting terrorism. So this is a good thing. People are starting to take more control of their own destiny rather than simply always defaulting to the United States, asking, Debbie who lives in Des Moines, Iowa, or Barry that lives in Baltimore to do the heavy lifting for other people around the world.
So let me end on a bit of a softball for you and ask you. You've mentioned the
What's
South
a
China
softball?
Sea. You've mentioned it's an American term. We don't
Sure,
understand,
no,
we
no,
don't
no.
understand these things,
Okay.
Ambassador. You've mentioned the South China Sea. You've mentioned North Korea. What are the things that occupy your brain in the international security space? What are the three biggest challenges that you see to U.S. and Australian interests as we move forward?
Well, the most significant immediate threat's North Korea, and then I wouldn't like to prioritise them, but and certainly not prioritising them in terms of importance, but they're the ones that you think and about the most. And then the second would be unquestionably the Middle East. Australia has, I see my good friend, the ambassador for Iraq here as well, who's, I don't want to be too effusive, I don't want to upset him, but who's a terrific advocate and representative of Iraq. And we're very concerned that we get Iraq, Afghanistan, that theatre right in partnership with the locals. That's hugely important. We have about the third biggest military presence in Iraq, and we've been there the whole time. Afghanistan with the United States has been our longest war, and we're still there in Afghanistan. So they are very challenging issues. And then, of course, the third is the threat of terrorism. And we've got returning fighters from the Middle East, which is a real challenge in our region. And we're working very collaboratively with our great friends in Indonesia, which is the biggest Islamic country in the world. So we're working very collaboratively with them, as we are with Malaysia, with the Philippines, to address the challenge of terrorism. There's a very real risk that Asia, Southeast Asia and Asia could become the next massive terrorist hotspot for the world if we don't get it right now. And it's what we're working on.
Very good. So let me open it up to all of you. I will say that I know that there are a number of journalists in the room who are writing on deadline, and so I would ask if I could just maybe take the first couple of questions if there are any journalists that would like to.
That's the other way around.
To ask it.
I
know. They want to talk. They want
Sorry,
to hear
we missed the deadline. How did that happen?
I would ask, and we'll start back here. I would ask you just to identify yourself as a courtesy to the ambassador.
Thank you. Yeah, we're well past deadline actually, but anyway, I'll take the opportunity. Ambassador, I wanted to ask you, as the Cameron Stewart from the Australian newspaper, wanted to ask you, the administration here is of course mulling its choices on the infrastructure package. There has been some speculation in the media that they might look at asset recycling. You're more or less the father of asset recycling in Australia. What lessons do you think could be learnt from that? Do you think it would be something that might be useful to the administration? Secondly, on the bilateral story of the day, which I can't really ignore, Malcolm Turnbull's comments, tongue-in-cheek mocking of Donald Trump, do you think that they were appropriate, and do you think that they may cause offence? Have you had any reaction on them?
No, I think, the administration hasn't rung us up, and I haven't been hauled into the White House and been sent back to Australia, so far as I'm aware. And although I saw a series of black cars outside. But no, quite seriously, I think people see it in context, and that's exactly what the American Embassy in Australia said. We have the equivalent of a White House correspondence dinner, and or the Catholic Archdiocese of New York dinner, where there's a bit of self-deprecation, a bit of roasting, but in Australia it had always been behind closed doors, and unfortunately, for the first time in I think 20 years, it was reported on, and of course the comments were taken completely out of context, which is very disappointing. So, but I think no, there's been no reaction that I'm aware of. In relation to infrastructure, yeah, I mean, it's we are having an influence on policy here. I mean, the President in his State of the Union address identified the immigration program in Australia and Canada as the two benchmarks. And of course, he admires the Australian health system, as he said recently. But infrastructure is where we're having quite a role, because we rolled out an innovative plan called asset recycling in my 2014 budget. And it's a great solution where you don't have the ready available money to go on a big spending spree on infrastructure. So the whole world is asking the question, how are we going to lift productivity? How are we going to lift growth? And of course, monetary policy, has gone as far as it can. In fact, the US is starting to tighten. Fiscal policy being budget policy, governments have run out of money. So they can't do it that way. So you've got to have this change, and you can only have change if you are facilitating it through better infrastructure. And so we need to improve infrastructure to get the world economy growing. And if you haven't got any money, what you've got to do is take it out of existing assets and put it into new assets. And in the United States, there's a vast amount of assets that are in the ownership of counties and cities, but they get no dividends, and those assets pay no tax. And they're capital starved, and in the case of airports, not only do they pay no dividends and they pay no tax, almost all the big airports in the US, they pay no dividends, they pay no tax, and they're subsidised by taxpayers with tax subsidies for the loans, the borrowings they make, which is kind of absurd. Why the taxpayers of America subsidising JFK or DFW or any of these airports, which are massive enterprises that people would like to lease? So if you want new infrastructure, you've got to have better management of your existing assets. And I've presented them a formula. I've been in deep conversations with virtually everyone in the administration on it, and they seem very attracted to it because it's a formula that works. Sydney has the highest number of cranes in the world of any city in the world today, and it's not an accident.
Well, to your first point, complicated politics aside, it was an uncanny impersonation, I will say. Yeah, he may have a career in late night when he leads politics.
Well, of course, the president was host of Late Night. Don't forget that.
That's right.
I haven't.
Are there any other journalists in the room that let me just go do a quick round first? And yes, ma'am.
Thanks. Jenny Leonard with Inside US Trade. You said that you were obviously very disappointed by the U.S. not signing on to TPP. And I know leading up to the potential lame duck vote, you were at the RNC, at the DNC. I saw you at many events talking about TPP. Obviously, Australia, I think, is in sort of a different boat than the other TPP countries that have said they're moving forward without the U.S. or trying to find a path for that. But is there any outreach from your administration to talk to the Trump administration to maybe get them on board to do something regionally or not only bilaterally in the Asia Pacific?
Well, the US has a very, very, very full dance card of trade ambitions at the moment. I mean, it's looking at NAFTA, it's looking at negotiating, or it's looking at all trade agreements, I understand, and it's looking at bilateral trade agreements. And, the thing about trade agreements is not only are they very complicated, but they are incredibly time-consuming. And the key thing about a trade agreement is you've got to be able to sell the benefits to your own population. And, the reason why you can't renegotiate TPP, because one country says it's not going to sign, is because the population of every other country goes, hang on, we're being screwed by that one country. So what are we giving up to get that one country on board? And, the politics of that is horrendous. You can't get over. So, there are alternatives. I mean, the trade ministers are actively discussing TPP -1. And, of course, RCEP, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which China and India and a number of other countries are involved, which is Asia for Asia. And there's a real momentum behind that at the moment in the wake of the US decision on TPP. So I think I understand the meaning of fair trade, and how the concept of free trade has been redefined over the years. But as innovative nations, we shouldn't be afraid of free and fair trade. And, you know, frankly, you mentioned infrastructure, Cameron. The demand for new infrastructure in Asia over the next 10 years is $7 trillion. The president was talking about $1 trillion of infrastructure in America. Asia is $7 trillion. It must have $7 trillion of new infrastructure to keep up with community demand in the next 10 years. So if you're a global investor, you've got choices now. You don't have to wait for 5 years for a county or a city to get through planning processes, because you can get something through pretty quickly in many Asian countries where it's desperately needed. So there are choices, and increasingly as Europe comes out of its economic funk, there's going to be more choices there as well.
Quick follow-up though, do you still have any hope that the U.S. will join maybe in a future administration, or what's your take on TPP 11 moving forward? And obviously
of course I'm hopeful. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we continue to advocate. We haven't changed. But bear in mind, it was, there was a bipartisan opposition. I mean, it was a Democrat administration that was relying on Republican support and couldn't get the Democrats. The majority of Democrats weren't supporting TPP. So, change of administration isn't necessarily going to deliver it. I mean, ultimately, people sign up to trade agreements out of self-interest. So we're going to show that being part of the Asian story is really attractive for the United States people.
Very good. Ma'am, we're going to bring you a microphone.
Hello, Ambassador.
You're right.
Marisa Lino with Northrop Grumman. Within the last several weeks, we had the first OSMIN in this administration, and you would have been part of the last administration's last OSMIN. I'm not asking you to compare the two, but would you say there are any particular highlights from this OSMIN in terms of outcomes that you would like to point to?
Share. No. No, because, it's meant to be a classified discussion. I wasn't at the last OSMIN because there wasn't one held in the election year, but my predecessor, Kim Beazley, was. But for those that had been at, but they said this was really good. And look, Secretary Tillerson said to me he thought it was terrific, as did Secretary Mattis. So it was great at our end as well. There were, a lot of detailed discussions about, the predictable issues: North Korea, terrorism, South China Sea, Iraq, Afghanistan. Foreign policy challenges in the region, and we offered some proposals which were of great interest. They offered some proposals to us, and it was a really productive meeting back in Sydney. Nice try.
It was a good try. It was an A for effort.
Yeah, no, it's a good effort. No.
Hi, I'm David Smith of The Guardian. You said you don't think America is walking away from its values, but what do you make of the perception, at least, that the president is really favouring countries such as China, the Philippines, Egypt, others that are seen as inimical to human rights, and actually falling out of love with the liberal democracies of Europe and maybe even Australia?
I don't think he's falling out of love. I think he's got a lot of love to give at the moment. And, look, the president's taking a results-oriented approach to international affairs. But I just say again that the alliances that truly matter are the ones based on shared values. They're the enduring ones. Leaders come and go everywhere, and we've seen that, but it's when you have the people-to-people relationships that it really matters. And there's been a lot of times in history that presidents have reached out to countries that might not have shared values, but in the national interest of the United States or the national interest of Australia or anything else, they might choose to do that. But it's certainly not the basis upon which you build lasting relationships.
Why don't we go right next door?
Hi, Sarah Griffin. I'm an intern here at Stimson with the Environmental Security Program. Stimson's currently working on a project with the Pew Charitable Trust to announce new marine reserves at the Our Oceans Conference in Malta in October. In June 2012, the government of Australia announced the creation of a new network of marine reserves, including the Coral Sea Commonwealth Reserve. And I'm wondering, what is the status of finalizing the Coral Sea Marine Reserve?
Well, it's currently well underway, and we are covering an area larger than the size of Egypt. So it's a pretty big area with a whole lot of, patches of inconsistency. Our plan is to try and have the overarching plan together by October. We might struggle to get to that particular date, but there's a tremendous amount of work that's gone into it. So we have a deep and abiding interest for not only environmental but for economic reasons to ensure that we protect our environment. And the Great Barrier Reef, for example, the largest living organism in the world, stretches, I think, 2,000 kilometres, and it's a huge tourist venue, and we've managed it very carefully for years. I've done a lot of scuba diving on the Great Barrier Reef, and you can see where it's, a lot of the negative impact on the reef has come not from human contribution, but just through climate change, through cyclones, through a range of other life cycles, and we're doing our very best and spending a lot of money doing our best to maintain and improve the quality of the Barrier Reef.
So it is safe to say that the Prime Minister does believe in climate change. Huh?
Our Prime Minister, yeah. Well,
Ma'am.
all of our Prime Ministers have. You got the last Prime Minister.
Hi, I'm Rachel Carrillo. I'm with the United Nations Association of Boulder, Colorado. But you mentioned the rise of terrorism and I believe human trafficking in Southeast Asia. And that's one of the major drivers climate change is actually one of the major drivers of migration and communities being vulnerable to exploitation like human trafficking that compounds the migration issues. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little more to what you meant about Southeast Asia and rising terrorism and the context of migration and the work that Australia is doing in light of the recent Manus refugee, I guess,
Sure.
payout is the best way to put it.
So there are a few issues there, and then they're in part related. The terrorism is about the returning fighters from Iraq and Syria, and obviously we're all trying to stop those people coming back. There are also a large number of convicted terrorists that are on the fringe of being released from jails after having served their term in Indonesia and a number of other countries. And so we're working very closely with those governments to try and help to prevent those people causing harm to communities. Now, places like the south of the Philippines, some other places in the region have very active terrorist cells. We are working incredibly closely with the governments to try and make sure they are extinguished. In relation to climate change is having a significant impact in the Pacific, there's no argument about that. In particular, we have refocused our foreign aid program to help most in the Pacific, and part of that is about helping to address or mitigate some of the impact of climate change. At a macro level, Australia is still obviously very committed to Paris, And the targets, at a micro level, we're doing a lot in the region and in our own country about CO2 emissions. In relation to migration generally, look, the best... I'm the son of a Palestinian refugee to Australia. You know, it was almost inconceivable that someone could end up as a treasurer of Australia or ambassador to Washington, you know. And I'm very proud of my heritage. He came as a refugee in 1948. And Australia, like the United States, is very multinational. People come from all corners of the earth, and we're a very, very embracing nation, as you are. No doubt about it. But the big issue for us, and I think increasingly in the United States, is you've got to control your borders. Because that's the way you can maintain public confidence in the immigration program. And Australia has been very strong, and it is bipartisan, very strong on ensuring that our borders are not breached by people claiming to be refugees, when in fact they are not, or are cherry-picking our nation out of others when they've transited through a number of other nations to claim refugee status in Australia. And we've been very strong. And we would not, Australians, the population of Australia would not cop seeing footage of children floating in the ocean above our nation, to the north of our nation, as has happened in the Mediterranean. Australians said no. And we had to do what we had to do to stop those boats coming, and there are no more deaths at sea, because they're not coming. Now that was, you know, from some people's perspective, ugly politics, from others' perspective, inhumane. But I tell you what, when Syrian refugees were crying out for somewhere to go, we were one of the first nations to put our hands up, and we took more per capita than anyone until Canada put their hand up. And we were able to do that with the full support of the Australian people, and we're able to run an immigration program of around 1% of population on a really regular basis without massive public debate in Australia. And we're able to do that because Australians know that we are able to control who comes to Australia and the circumstances under which they come. And we make no apologies for that. And I can understand, you know, in the United States, if we had the equivalent of 10 or 20 million people in the community who had no papers, who had no identification, if we had the equivalent of that, the Australian people would be ropeable. And you know, I can understand the debate here. It doesn't mean you're a heartless people. Don't build yourselves up about it. It's just, you know, the fact is people do want to control their borders. People want to control, you know, the who comes into their home. It's a natural human instinct everywhere in the world. Doesn't mean we're less compassionate.
So, Ambassador, your colleagues are going to be upset with me because I'm going to wreck your schedule. But there are many questions. I wonder if we could squeeze one last one last one in. Why don't we go here?
Hello, Ambassador. To a related question to that, a couple of forces that play into your view of the future, perhaps. The declining cost of fossil fuels in the Middle East and the rapidly growing emphasis on knowledge-based economies. Now, if you look at what's going on in the Middle East, which is impacting Australia and so much of Europe and us, how do you see our response, meaning the developed Western world's response, to the instability that I think is going to increase in the Middle East as fossil fuel values and prices and revenues decline, and the populations, which are, 50, 60% under age 30, uneducated, unemployed, and to a great degree. What do you see going forward 5, 10, 15 years from now?
Well, you know, that's a huge question. In relation to for example, oil, you know, I asked one CEO of a major global energy company last night at dinner, you know, we used to talk about peak supply of oil. Now we're talking about peak demand. So the question is, what is peak demand? And one hand, he says, look, the one scenario is 2023 and the outer scenario is 2070. So, you know, but battery technology is moving quickly, but not as quickly as some think. You know, obviously, electric cars are changing the demand cycle, but also energy supply generally. And of course, the Middle East has a hell of a lot of gas. You know, in fact, Australia will probably pass Qatar as the biggest supplier of liquid gas in the world this year. But the Middle East has a huge amount of gas. And so its capacity to supply energy to not only Europe, but also, I think, a much bigger market even is Asia, is still very significant and will continue for a while. So I don't see, you know, I mean, we're the biggest exporter of coal in the world, even though China's the biggest miner. The US is the second biggest. We're the biggest exporter, just past Indonesia, and that's because we have a quality of coal that no one's found a substitute for, particularly in the manufacturing of steel and a range of other things. So, you know, I don't see that energy supply equation having any immediate impact on the Middle East. The fundamental challenge in the Middle East is a lot of countries, you know, haven't ever felt comfortable with people drawing a line on a map saying this is my part of the land, this is your part of the land. I mean, the Middle East, like Africa, like Australia, like many other, you know, regions, continents, there are tribes that travel across borders, and there are fierce tribal loyalties, there are fierce community loyalties. It's just not easy to solve within the parameters of modern definitions of what a country is, or modern definitions of what relationships and allies are. So, do I have a solution on peace in the Middle East? No. But what I do know is that I do see it as potentially a very significant step, what happened when President Trump visited recently Saudi Arabia, and the partnership that has been forged between Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Jordan and Israel, to name a few. That is and the UAE, that is a really potential, well, it's a change in the narrative, right? And something needed to happen. And something did happen, right? So this tends to head in a positive direction. The challenge is where to Iran, where to Syria, and I don't think we've got the rest of the day to talk about.
Well, Ambassador, you are a remarkable advocate for the Australian people here in Washington, and we're really deeply grateful to you, and I will invite the audience to share in that gratitude. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Brian. Thanks.